Good afternoon. Welcome to the Chapter 3, Troy SCISA, Political Science 2241 lecture. We'll begin at the beginning of the chapter, which is on federalism on page 63. I'm going to give you a few terms that I think are very important that I think you should know as we begin this chapter. Let's talk about federalism, which is on page 65. A system of government in which power is divided by a constitution between the central or national government and the regional state governments. If you look there on that page, you will see on 65, 66, and 67 that can basically mean shared powers. That is a very simplistic term. There are other governments around the world that have a federal type of system, but please keep in mind that the power is shared with ultimate power resting in the hands of the national government. And that's what we have here in our country today. Now, I do want to talk about just a few terms that I think are very important. I want to talk about different types of powers. We'll start with concurrent powers. Concurrent powers on page 67 are powers exercised by both the federal and the state government. So they both have power. If you look a little further along, you'll see express powers on 65. Express powers are specific powers granted to the Congress in the Constitution. They are specifically written into the Constitution. Then, of course, if you look also on page 65, you'll see implied powers. Implied powers, are powers derived from the necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Such powers are not specifically expressed, but are implied through the expansive interpretation of the delegated powers. And I think that's so very important for us to understand that those powers, that the separation of powers in our government are instrumental in what we do and how we do it. The necessary and proper clause is a provision from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that provides Congress with the authority to make all laws necessary and proper to the carrying out of the express power. So I think that's really important as we talk about those types of things. And then finally, I want to talk about reserve powers. Reserve powers on page 66, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, which aims to reserve powers to the states and actually to the people of the states. So I didn't want to go over those terms before we move forward because I think that's so very important. So moving on from page 65, federalism comes from our Constitution. It says rights by granting a few express powers specifically granted to the Constitution, the national government, and reserving all the rest for the states. So you can see that only those powers that are expressly given to Congress can they enact. Now, they do have implied powers, which allows them to interpret the Constitution more broadly and enact laws and policies that would, of course, enhance those particular powers that they have. So we've talked about implied powers. We've talked about the necessary and proper clause, which also can be known as the elastic clause. As we move forward, we've also talked about the powers of state government and reserve powers. And we also have talked about, and I don't spend a lot of time in these lectures talking about police powers, the state's authority to regulate the health, safety, and morals of its citizens is commonly referred to as police power of the state. Policing is what the states do. They coerce you by the name of the community in order to maintain public order. States do have obligations to one another. That's called in Article 4, Section 1, full faith and credit clause. That's very, very, very important that you know that when you own property in South Carolina, if you move to another state, you still own that property. When you drive into another state from South Carolina and you have a valid South Carolina license plate, you, of course, are recognized as having a license. That would be full faith and credit. Then, of course, we talk about privileges and immunities. That is also from Article 4, Section 2. This clause basically is along the same lines that you enjoy the same rights from one state to another. They can't take rights away from you. Now, I think it's really important that you understand that local states are under the Constitution. Local communities are under the state constitutions, and it is required in our Constitution that all states have their own constitution as well, and they do have to abide by and go along with the United States Constitution. Now, let's talk about the definition of federalism and how it's changed radically over time. Many of the fiercest political controversies in American history have revolved around competing views of federalism. We have talked specifically about traditional systems in our country, which occurred from the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, really until 1933, and the New Deal illustrated a change in radical federalism, because federalism really started to take more control over our daily lives. Federalism under the traditional system gave most powers to the state, and that would have been called dual federalism, where the state really enacted much of its own laws that helped the people of its state. Today, we really have some of that, but it's really more authoritarian by the federal government itself. If you look on table 3.2, page 70, you will see national government policies, which are domestic policies, which deal with international imports, subsidies, tariffs, public land disposal, patents, and currency. And we can say what state policies do in the traditional sense, and what local agencies do. So I think it's important that you have an understanding about what dual federalism is. And then, of course, on page 72, we talk about the Supreme Court waved the way to an end of our traditional federalism system. And basically that's because the Supreme Court consistently interpreted this Commerce Clause that's in the United States Constitution in favor of national power. The first of these important cases involving national power over the economy was McCulloch versus Maryland. That's a very, very important court case. And this case involves a question of whether Congress had the power to charter a national bank. If you can see, the charter of the bank, since it was not granted explicitly, the power was nowhere found in Article 1, Section 8, and I would strongly suggest you read that portion of course, the Constitution. It says, Chief Justice John Marshall answered that the power could be implied from other powers that were expressly delegated. Now you see where those terms come from. Delegated to Congress, such as powers to lay and collect taxes, to borrow money, to regulate commerce, and to declare and conduct a war. So you can see, because of judicial review and the court case McCulloch versus Maryland, much of our traditional system of federalism changed. That was the broad-based interpretation that occurred prior to 1933, and of course that's where we had an end in 1933 to the traditionalist way of interpreting dual federalism. Now, if you look, you'll see there's an argument on page 74 about states' rights. In addition, the 10th Amendment was used to bolster arguments about states' rights. The principle that the state should oppose the increasing authority of the national government. This principle was most popular in the period before the Civil War. In the early 20th century, however, the 10th Amendment appeared to lose its force as reformers began to press the national regulations to limit the power of large corporations. You probably heard that in the Sherman Antitrust Act and many other acts that occurred because of that. FDR's New Deal remade the government, and it certainly did. It ushered in what we now know as modern dual federalism. You can look on page 75, the rise and decline of recovery and federal aid. We have different areas of our government that when we collect taxes, a large portion are sent back to the states in multiple different facets. One is called a grant and aid. A grant and aid are programs through which Congress provides money to states and local governments on the condition that the funds be employed for purposes designed by the federal government. Then you have categorical grants. These newer types of federal grants, known as categorical grants, because the grants are given to states and localities by the national government on the condition that expenditures be limited to a problem or group specified by law. I would strongly suggest that you look and you read those definitions of what a block grant is, and of course, what categorical grants. As we move forward, you can see there's a term on page 77 called cooperative federalism. If the traditional federalist model of two sovereigns performing highly different functions could be called dual federalism, historians of federalism suggest that the system since the New Deal is called cooperative federalism, in which grant and aids have been used strategically, notice that word strategically, to encourage states and localities to pursue nationally defined goals, with national and states government sharing power and resources via intergovernmental cooperation. I think that's really important that we understand what that cooperative federalism is basically, where those particular areas of the government through grant and aids and those types of things enable both the state and the national government to succeed. You can look on dual federalism. There's a great picture on page 78 of dual federalism versus cooperative federalism. And of course, we have cooperative federalism today, and you can see they blend with one another, whereas in dual federalism, which was prior to the New Deal, they did not blend at all. I think that's a great, great illustration. Then, of course, you can look and see some other topics that we need to cover on 79, from terms such as presumption, the principle that allows the national government to override state, local actions in certain policy ways, to, of course, unfunded mandates, which are programs that will continue to have funding issues for many, many years after the mandate has been initiated. Looking on over, you can see on page 81, block grants, general revenue sharing, and new federalism. New federalism can be defined as returning power to the states through block grants. And of course, block grants we've already discussed to some degree, a way to reduce federal control by appropriating money from the federal government to the states. I think it's important that you look on there's a timeline on page 81, which specifically talks about the changing federal framework, and you can see where dual federalism occurred from 1789 to 1937. From 1937 to 1960 was cooperative federalism, and you need to know these terms. And of course, from 1960 to the 1970s, regulated federalism, and then new federalism from 1970 to where we are today. There's a balance between the two, there's no doubt about that. You can look and see where regulations occur and how that affects our government and how much money goes into different areas, from block grants, from revenue sharing, and the de-evolution of power, which we'll talk about. I think it's important that we understand all of these topics in chapter 3. Again, I'm going to read some definitions because I think they're important. Block grants are federal grants that allow states considerable leeway or discretion in how the funds are spent. Categorical grants on page 76 are congressional grants given to states and localities on the condition that expenditures be limited to the problem or group specified by law. We've talked about some of those other particular areas as we go in. Grant and aid on page 75, programs through which Congress provides money to states and local governments on the condition that the funds be employed for purposes defined by the federal government. And then, of course, I think it's important for us to understand that all of these types of issues are really important to how our economy works today. Those different types, you have two different types of restraint, federal restraint, and of course judicial restraint, which goes along with both. That'll bring us an end to chapter 3. Thank you.